Good morning. My name is Kang of the KEI, North Korea Environment Information Center. Is he with us today? Hello, my name is Oh Kyung-sub. Next, we also have Han Sang-un from the Korea Environment Institute. Hello, I'm from KEI. My name is Han Sang-un. Also joining us online is going to be talking about water supply and DPRK from Gyeongnam University, Professor Kim Seung-hyun. Hello. Professor Kim, can you hear me? Professor Kim, we can't really hear you. Maybe we can check your sound later to fix the sound issue before we get to you. Our last presenter for the morning session is from Hankuk University, Dr. Hong Yoon-gun. Hello, it is a pleasure to meet you. Oh, we do have some participants who are going to be giving their presentation offline. We do have some with us today. Lee Ki-young from Gyeonggi Research Institute, who is joining us online. Hello. We also have some discussants with us today. I'm going to introduce our discussants later on. Now, we would like to begin the KEI and HK+ National Strategies Research Project Agency Joint International Conference on Supra-National Cooperation and Communication for the Sustainable Development of the Korean Peninsula. When you give your presentation, I would like to make sure to ask you to wear the face masks that we have prepared for you today, and please keep them on during your presentation. I'd like to ask you to keep within 20 minutes. We're going in order of the agenda here. We will first like to hear from Oh Kyung-sub, Korea Institute for National Institute on Governing Discourse and Economic Policy in the Kim Jong-un Regime.
Good morning. I am Oh Kyung-sub from the Korea Institute for National Unification. Can you hear me well? Yes. I wasn't really able to hear the moderator clearly. I hope that you will increase the volume. I'm going to discuss the governing discourse and economic policies under Kim Jong-un. This is a topic that you can approach from the political studies perspective. So I'm going to apply the political studies perspective to understand economic policies, and this is the content of my presentation. First, I'm going to discuss how there is this dual structure of the national goals and strategies shown in the governing discourse of Kim Jong-un, and then I'm going to discuss the goals and content of economic policies to achieve these national goals. And finally, I'm going to offer an analysis of whether these economic policies have succeeded in achieving these goals. When it comes to the governing discourse of Chairman Kim Jong-un, this is basically represented in his speeches and his texts. So you can analyze the written texts as well as oral speeches delivered by Chairman Kim in order to understand the governing discourse. Now, moving on to the dual structure of the national goals and strategies, their number one priority in ruling the regime is to maintain the one-person regime of Chairman Kim Jong-un, and in order to do so, they need the financial resources and money to rule. And secondly, they need financial resources to give rewards to the elite class members, because Chairman Kim Jong-un needs loyalty of these elite class members. They need to be given incentives and rewards so that they can maintain their loyalty to Chairman Kim. And at the same time, you can see that nomenclatura system is in place. It means that there are certain privileges enjoyed by the very few ruling class, and it's not outright expressed, but this is indeed one of the most important national goals. The second national goal is what is called the official national strategy and policies, and here you can see that there are national goals and strategic goals and the two key policies. The national strategy is a complete victory of socialism, and the strategic goal is to build a strong socialist country, and the two key policy priorities are developing nuclear weapons and develop the economy. Moving on to the economic policies, I believe that these economic policies are instrumental to achieving the national goals. As I mentioned before, it is critical for Chairman Kim to maintain his control over the regime and to implement these national goals. They utilize the economic policies. In other words, economic policies are instrumental to maintaining Chairman Kim's control over the country. Therefore, their number one priority in implementing economic policies is to create a pool of financial resources for Chairman Kim. And secondly, they are focused on building the weapons capabilities and military forces. And the third objective is to improve the quality of the people's lives. But as you can see, improving the quality of life of residents in North Korea are not their number one priority. Now let's take a look at the structure of the DPRK economy and the implications. And here, not much research has been done, but there are triple structures in place. When you examine the North Korean economy, they have the second economic commission, which is under the Chairman Kim. So the first economy is the party economy. The second economy is the military and defense economy. And the third economy is the economy for the people, which is run by the cabinet. As for these researchers who examine the North Korean economy as a triple structure, they say that the party economy and the second economy take up about 70% of the DPRK economy, but we don't have specific statistics. So we don't really know the size of the party economy versus the second economy versus the people's economy. But overall, you can understand that the North Korean economy can be broken into three categories. And the people's economy is taking up the smallest portion. Now let's take a look at the implications of the economic policies. As I mentioned before, their number one priority is to secure financial resources for Kim Jong-un's ruling, and there are subordinate policies that are instrumental to achieving national goals and policies. Now let's take a look at the economic policies expressed in Chairman Kim's discourse. On April 16, 2012, in his speech, he mentioned that their number one goal is to build a strong economy. And so the economic policy objective is to improve the economic development and improve the quality of life. They declared that they would build a self-reliant economy. This means that the DPRK will pursue economic production and economic development on its own. So basically, it's centered on the notion of self-reliance. And secondly, they said they would increase the production of the basic industries. And then there are energy and other infrastructures, including power generation and coal production and steel production and railway construction. These are the infrastructure-related areas, but they did not lay out the specific approaches. And then they said that they would promote the development of the agricultural industry, the light manufacturing industry, and the livestock and fisheries industries. So there are all these areas that they focused on, but the specific plans would have been carried out. But when Chairman Kim Jong-un delivers speeches, he would just give out very high-level discussions. And then Chairman Kim said that they would increase the production based on socialism, and they would promote scientific development and automation. So basically it's saying that they were going to introduce some scientific approaches, and they said that they would improve the economic management methods. But still, they adhere to the socialist approach to economic development and economic management. So the overall basic principle of control or state control in the economy is the same. In 2013, Chairman Kim announced the dual policy or Pyeongjin policy for economic development and nuclear arsenal development. And the objective is to build a strong socialist economy. And specifically for economic policies, Chairman Kim said they will build a strong basic industries. And also he declared that the DPRK economy would transform into a knowledge-based economy. And also said that they would increase self-reliance in resources and basic supplies and metal and chemical industries. And these are serving as fundamental industries for the economy. Currently, resources and other materials are in short supply in the PRK. So they wanted to improve this. And Chairman Kim said that they will continue to develop science and technology and pursue space development, which is quite related to nuclear development programs. And Chairman Kim said that it would improve the economic management styles and said that it would diversify trade routes. But later, the UN sanctions were implemented, so diversification of international trade was not possible. And in 2013, Chairman Kim said that they would develop the tourism areas and economic special zones. But for Wonsan district, they kept on developing Wonsan district for tourism purposes. Because the DPRK's production base is very deteriorated, they wanted to promote tourism to earn revenue. And this approach has been pursued since the late 1980s, so that has been continuing even to this date. But overall conditions were not favorable. So there were many limitations as to promoting their tourism industry. And when you look at the speech delivered by Chairman Kim on April 20th, 2018, he declared that there will be a full focus on economic development, and this was around the time when talks with the U.S. began. And there were some expectations about DPRK-U.S. high-level meetings. And at the 7th Central Committee, they announced that they've completed their nuclear capabilities in 2017. Because of that, they said that they would focus on developing the social economy, and they will promote the quality of life and modernizing and informatizing and digitalizing their economy. And they also focus on self-reliance and self-supply. So the basic idea here is to promote the DPRK economy by strengthening their self-reliance capabilities and applying technology and science. And that was about the time when the DPRK was engaged in some talks with the U.S., and they said that they've already completed their nuclear development. And at that time, Chairman Kim expressed his willingness to talk to the U.S. But on December 31st of 2019, Chairman Kim declared a new path. It was after the Hanoi talks with the U.S. did not end very well. And at that time, DPRK had to put pressure on the U.S. And that is why Chairman Kim said there would be a heads-on breakthrough. And he showed a strong determination to break away from the sanctions by strengthening their self-reliance. And Chairman Kim said that we would have to reform the economy and maximize the production potential to improve the quality of life and promote economic development. And this means that despite the sanctions, while DPRK is not really able to engage in international trade, they said that they would focus on internal production. So as you can see, there have been a series of economic policies announced by Chairman Kim, and these discourse and these plans have been very much in line with what had happened to the DPRK and U.S. negotiations and what has happened to the DPRK economy in reality. Between 2016 and 2020, there was this 5-year economic development plan, but North Korea admitted that this plan failed. In August 2020, at the 6th plenary meeting of the 7th Central Committee, Chairman Kim Jong-un admitted that this 5-year economic development plan did not succeed. And he said that he was going to announce another economic development plan, but there aren't many possibilities for better economic development because the surrounding conditions are not favorable. And the DPRK economy has been deteriorating for many different reasons, including the sanctions, UN sanctions on North Korea, which began since 2017. And because of a very strong UN sanctions on North Korea, they're not really able to export resources overseas. And this issue of decline in resource exports has been a huge impact on DPRK leadership because in the past, their export of natural resources was a main source of income for the ruling class. But now, because of this issue, the elite class members are not really incentivized to maintain loyalty to Chairman Kim. Since 2017, North Korea is not able to export coal and iron ore resources. So this has been dealt a huge blow to their ability to secure financial resources for the regime. So we need to take a look at some of the statistics and the resources, data that are available. And some researchers argue, Jang Young-soo and Kim Chan-chul, made some estimation based on the available data. As of the end of 2018, the foreign currency reserves would be about $2.5 to $5.8 billion. And by 2020, if North Korea is not able to export while continuing to import commodities, then this foreign currency reserve would be depleted almost, and maximum $2 billion only. And this means that there is a huge pressure on the Korean People's Party ability to secure financial resources. Let's take a look at the breakdown between 2016 and 2020. By 2019, there was import of middle goods or consumer goods. But in 2020, you can see that there has been a dramatic decline in the import of middle commodities and consumer goods. And this means that there is a sharp decline in the trade volume. And once again, it means that the ruling class is not able to benefit commercially or financially from these international activities. And when you look at the trend of DPRK's trade with China between 2016 and 2020, there has been a dramatic increase in the trade deficit on the part of DPRK. In 2016, it was 1.6 billion won, and then increased to 2 billion won and 2.5 billion won going forward. Because DPRK is not able to export natural resources, their trade deficit has been increasing. And in the first half of this year, there's about $300 million of trade deficit so far. So overall, first of all, the trade volume itself has declined dramatically, and the trade deficit since 2017 has been increased from $1.6 billion to $2.3 billion. But this year, in year 2020, it's not only the exports but also the imports that have declined substantially. So the amount of trade deficit has been reduced as well. Now let's take a look at some of the outlooks for DPRK economy in the future. Now, as I mentioned, the trade volume is declining and foreign currency reserves are declining as well. And this means that Chairman Kim's number one priority of securing financial resources for the regime would be very difficult. And if the UN sanctions are not lifted in the near future, then this will be a huge pressure on Chairman Kim's regime. And secondly, Chairman Kim and his leadership have been excavating resources to maintain the control over the economy, but overall the trade volume has been reducing and there's not a lot of supply or inflow of foreign currency into the DPRK. So given this, there is a very difficult situation financially for the regime. And at the same time, they have been investing in nuclear programs and military and defense forces. Even though there's economic difficulties, the DPRK continues to run its military and defense facilities because they need to build their nuclear capabilities. And they also need to continue to operate their military forces. Even several decades ago, when there was a huge economic depression in the U.S., in DPRK, they still had to maintain their military forces. So regardless of their economic situations, the military industry continues on in its operation. And currently, the regime is struggling with trade and also with foreign currency reserves, and it's ultimately going to have some impact on its defense and military industry. And there is a very high likelihood for the regime to fail to improve the quality of life of the people. And in the meantime, the production and the people or grassroots economic activities have been slowing down as well. So it means that the economy in the future is going to be very difficult. And currently, with the COVID-19 pandemic going on and UN sanctions still in place, there are many challenges. But in the future, when the DPRK resumes its trade with China, there will be increase in import of consumer goods and commodities coming from China. So that may relieve some of the difficulties of the people. But fundamentally, the trade volume will continue to reduce, and the regime's capability of securing financial resources for their governance, it's going to be affected. So in short, what I want to say is that in DPRK, the economic policies have two important goals. Number one, priority is to bring about financial resources and other resources for the regime. And the second objective of the economic policies is to improve people's lives. But the second goal is subordinate to the first goal because there are more emphasis on building military forces and defense capabilities. So overall, I would say that the DPRK is experiencing huge hurdles and obstacles in achieving these two objectives of the economic policies. And in order to overcome these challenges, it is very much up to the UN sanctions, whether these sanctions will be lifted or not. Of course, Chairman Kim is arguing for self-reliance and resilience and internal production. But if there's no inflow of capital or resources from the outside, it's going to be very challenging. So once again, we have to see whether there will be conditions conducive to inflow of capital and resources from the outside world. And once again, this is very much related to the future prospect of negotiations between the DPRK and the US. But as of now, it is not likely for DPRK to give up its nuclear programs. And this means that these economic hardships within DPRK may continue for some time. And if these economic struggles continue, they will not only have an impact or negative impact on people's lives, but also on the regime's control over the country. And with that, I'd like to wrap up my presentation. Thank you very much. So you discussed how these economic policies have played out in the DPRK, the current situations, and whether economic objectives have been met or not. There's a very close relationship between economic policies and the environment and many other aspects. I think that his presentation has very important implications for all of us.
Next, we would like to hear the presentation under the theme Task and Prospects for the Future Integration of Environmental Legislation of the Korean Peninsula by Han Sang-un, Korea Environment Institute. I'd like to ask you to keep within 18 minutes. Yes, can you hear me? I don't think you can hear me. Yes, I am Han Sang-un of KEI. Can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you. Yes, today I'm going to talk about the need for an integration between inter-Korean environmental laws and legal frameworks. I know that this is a little bit interesting, and it's going to be rare to talk about environmental laws as they exist in North Korea. On Friday, there's going to be a big seminar on other North Korean scholars. And in that seminar, there's going to be no mention about environmental acts and environmental laws. I think that when we talk about inter-Korean cooperation, we should always have welfare and environment as the starting points. I'd like to ask you to consider that as you listen to my presentation and I talk about the future prospects for integration between the environmental legal frameworks of our two countries as we lead up to ultimate unification. Of course, there are many different environmental pollution standards as they apply to South Korea, and I want to talk about how we're going to apply them to North Korea going forward. I would like to say that this presentation is based on activities done by the Korea-German Advisory Committee. This is a vice ministerial level committee, and in 2017, I had the opportunity to present before this committee on environmental acts and environmental laws, and the committee is sponsored by the Ministry of Unification. So I would like to ask you to please take that into consideration. In legal studies, when we talk about legal integration, there are three things that we have to consider. When there are two very heterogeneous communities and they unite to form a single community and to have a unified legal framework, they need to come up with a single law to govern that area. So we need to have a single unified legal framework. That means we need to legislate. And secondly, there needs to be an enforcement agency who would enforce the laws that are in place. So even if the laws have been legislated, if they cannot be enforced, that we cannot say that there's been a proper integration of the legal framework. So there needs to be an enforcement agency in place. And thirdly, probably the most important, is that the residents of the two Koreas have to accept this as a legal order. They need to recognize this as law, as the law that governs the land. There needs to be this legal confirmation by the public And only then can this integrated legal framework truly stand. Well, in a future unified Korean peninsula, I would think that Korea, that new Korea, would also be a country founded on the rule of law. So, yes, I have to say I'm not very familiar with this style of presenting, but in any case, so in establishing a legal framework, it would be a very important part of our tasks as we become a unified Korea. So as we become more of a country founded on rule of law, we have to also establish a basis for this environmental legal framework. However, when we pursue these discussions, we often talk about this one Korea community and North Korea's Korea federalist system. Am I supposed to use this clicker? It's not working. I'm very sorry. So, in discussing the directionality of this integrated legal framework, we would have to base that on the premise that we're going to have gradual and phased unification, and we need to have both substantial and procedural legitimacy. In which case, we need to have the participation and consensus by the North Korean residents as well, as we pursue this integrated legal framework. Before integration, there will be some things that we have to do and some things that we have to do after this integration. So I'm going to separate these two, and also I would like to tell you that I'm drawing upon case examples of Germany. Some of the things that we have to do before we integrate the legal frameworks is that for this charter on a unified Korea or a federal Korean state, there needs to be a charter on the environment as well that would state the importance of environmental protection and sustainable development. We need to declare an environment charter that would include this initiative both by South Korea and North Korea before we have integration. And on the second line there, you would see that there needs to also be mention of our commitment to foster and development DPRK as an environmentally friendly zone. This is also something that we were able to draw from the German case, because Germany also underwent a similar discourse in their country leading up to unification. There was the West German development theory. But if we look at the past German case, we would have to look at an environmental charter as the best task that we must fulfill before integration, and talk about the restructuring of the environmental space in North Korea. Other things that we can do before integration is that we can have a preemptive inter-Korean environmental projects. We often talk about the importance of having inter-Korean environmental projects, but in that process, we have to absolutely review the environmental acts in place, because even if we were to try to engage in projects, maybe the projects would go against South Korean law, or they could go against North Korean law. So the two parties involved have to discuss the environmental acts, existing laws in place, and there needs to be a newly established legal basis for these environmental cooperative projects. There needs to be a sort of a working level forum that could discuss this work. And even before legal integration, perhaps the participation of experts who do not have a good field expertise, that could lead to much chaos and confusion, even if there was some work leading up to these cooperative environmental projects. So there needs to be, again, a working level of forum. And in that regard, the government can discuss ways to support this working level forum. And what's very important is that we want to secure the sustainability and the safety of this inter-Korean exchange. And to do so, we need to also have a legal basis for such funding and transparent sharing of information. So this transparent sharing of information is obviously very important, but to make this more clear, there needs to be an establishment of a legal basis. If we take a look at existing cases, we've seen that many times the projects would change around depending on the administration in place. There are many different international organizations, especially those devoted to environment protection. And so South Korea can discuss ways to share information with these international organizations in a stake for increased transparency, and this can also help the international community enhance their credibility of DPRK and have more trust, build more trust of DPRK. There are many different international legal issues that DPRK has, especially when it comes to environmental protection, and so we can review some measures to minimize these issues together with the consultations with working level experts. So one of the first tasks that we should do in legislation is to review and improve the obstacles to implementing projects and laws based on Cold War thinking. And the second legislative task that we have to undertake is that we have to newly establish a legal basis and institutional mechanisms to secure the sustainability and safety of these cooperative projects. When we have actual discussions about integration of the legal frameworks, what should we do? There could be some debates about whether we're going to apply South Korean laws or DPRK laws. So here I'm considering the DPRK case. These discussions have to be very strictly limited, so I'd like to ask you for your understanding in that regard. I'm trying to think about what we have to do to try to apply the South Korean legal framework to North Korea, especially when it comes to environment issues. The environmental laws as they exist in North Korea are very simple and they're very broad-based, so they cannot be largely applied to the case in South Korea. So in this case, I have to say that it's perhaps the South Korean legal framework that will be applied to DPRK. So that will be the best direction going forward. I'm not saying this because I'm a South Korean person, but because the South Korean laws are more comprehensive and more detailed, whereas DPRK environmental laws are a little bit more simple and concise. And so this would be very important to discuss because, once again, we have to discuss the importance of establishing a legal basis for probably an inter-Korean task force and integration of environmental laws. After this inter-Korean task force or some sort of group is founded first, then their work can build up to actual legislation. So the third legislation task that we have to undertake is to pass and act on the establishment of such inter-Korean task force. And then we move on to a discussion of what we should do in the transitional period. We need a transitional period leading up to legal integration because I mentioned that this is based on the assumption that we're going to have very gradual and phase unification. And so in that case, if we do not suppose that there is going to be mutual existence founded in cooperation between the two Koreas, then we cannot have a very integrated lead up to unification, because that means that we cannot have a phased step-by-step discussion on unification. It's going to take some time to establish an implementation body, and also it will take a lot of time for the residents, for the public, to have a legal certainty about these integrated laws. So there needs to be very sufficient time that has to be guaranteed, which is why we need a transitional period. Which laws will be applied to North Korea during this transitional period? Are we going to expand a South Korean case and apply North Korean law on a temporary basis, or are we going to apply DPRK laws on a temporary basis and have an exclusive application of certain areas of South Korean law? But this is only going to be applied during the transitional period. If we're going to expand South Korean laws, that means that we can have environmental protection of DPRK, but this means that we will have a lot of instability. However, if we just maintain DPRK law for a temporary period, sort of have a grace period, then that means that there could be legal stability for the DPRK case, but that we might not have enough environmental protection for the DPRK region. This could lead to many problems in the actual regard of environmental protection. So if we look at the German case, if the transitional period becomes too long, there were significant economic costs that were derived because of the prolonged need for environmental protection. So we would have to take these two values of legal stability and environmental protection and choose between one of these two. And our basis for choosing is to try to really understand the actual status of the environment in the DPRK. If the environmental pollution levels are very severe in the DPRK, then we would have to prioritize environmental protection rather than legal stability, in which case then we can expand South Korean legal system first. So again, this has to be followed by an environmental status survey of DPRK, which is why we need to have an Inter-Korean Joint Status Review Committee. This joint committee has to be established as soon as possible, no matter what the outcome is. And this is a personal hope of mine. This joint committee will do a research or a survey of the environmental situation of the DPRK, and they will publish a white paper on the DPRK environment. And then they would announce what to do, and then we could have a legislative notice, and then that could lead up to legislation. So the fourth legislative task is to have an act on Inter-Korean Joint Status Review Committee so that they could publish a white paper. If we're going to apply some parts of DPRK environmental law on an exemption basis, which I think that we will have to do no matter what happens, there might be some areas that could be delayed, some areas that could be applied. So for specific regions in the DPRK where the pollution levels are quite severe, we can come up with special countermeasures or legislate an act on supporting these particular regions. This having a grace period is very similar to what the German case did with the Umweltrahmen. But again, having this act legislated is going to be the most direct way to allow this to happen. these 3 goals would have to be included as an appendix to that act, but I have to say that this is not going to be easy. So I would like to go here, and there are some case reviews that I also included in my presentation on environmental pollution, air pollution, natural reserves, biospheres, water pollution, and emissions limits. But lastly, I just would like to say that I did mention this in the opening, but are we going to go the way of ecological restructuring, or are we going to follow what the Germans did and go the way of the so-called West Germany development model? The West Germany development model, if we were to apply that to the Korean Peninsula, we would have to call it the South Korea development model. The German case, now 30 years after what happened, we are reviewing the German case. The Germans say that the West German development model was not actually 100% desirable, and in fact, there are some areas where the economic cost burden was very excessive. So we can go by way of the ecological restructuring, which could be a way to decrease the economic cost burden in the long term and would be more fitting to the Korean Peninsula case. I would conclude my presentation there. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Han. I think that environmental study is something that is being approached by different disciplines. And yes, I think that we also have to have a legal approach to environmental protection as well. When going forward, I hope that you can take apart and do a more phased approach to these inter-Korean environmental legal framework integration.
Next, I'm going to invite Professor Seung-hyun Kim from Gyeongnam University. The topic is water supply in DPRK. I'd like to give you 18 minutes for your presentation. I'm sorry, but we cannot hear you. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me? Yes. Now we can hear you. Can I share my screen? Yes, you can share your screen. Okay, if you allow me to share the screen, let me do so. Now I'd like to begin my presentation on the topic of water supply in DPRK and what we need to do. When it comes to water supply situations in DPRK, this is very closely related to the residents in North Korea. Here, you can look at this pie chart announced by UNICEF in 2010. But according to this data, you can see that water supply situations are closely related to the health conditions of the residents there. They took a look at the causes of death for children under the age of 5. You may not be able to see these details, but the second most important cause is diarrhea, and diarrhea is related to providing clean water. If they can get access to clean drinking water, they can avoid getting diarrhea. Usually, children get diarrhea when the water is contaminated. And this is an example of how the water situations in North Korea are very dire. You can also look at the situations in educational facilities and hospitals and how these groundwater sources in residential areas are contaminated or polluted, and many water facilities are not well maintained. So there have been many documents about them and some research studies out there. But what we need to understand is the basic problem of North Korea in terms of water supply. Of course, there are some documents out there, but they may not be very helpful. We are interested in how to provide or how to build water works in North Korea. Some cases we may build the small facilities. In some other areas we may build larger facilities, and we should be able to understand the actual reality of the situations in North Korea. If we are to build any waterworks or water facilities, you first need to establish a basic plan. And this basic plan has to include information such as water supply situations and how they are different by regions, and whether there's how much the demand and supply of residential water is there, and whether we have enough water sources, and what about the water quality of the water sources. So all these things have to be examined, and then you also have to take a look at the current situation of the waterworks, and then all these need to be combined together to analyze the overall situation and then build a basic plan. And of course, the overall water supply chain is important as well. So in my presentation, I'm going to gather all the quantitative data about water situations in North Korea. I looked at the literature and the previous research studies and other documents available. Now first, let's take a look at the supply ratio, water supply ratio. This is the percentage of the total population who have access to managed water. Here, the access to managed water is providing water through the water pipes. So when there's piped water supply, it means that you can manage the quality of water, and you can assume that there's a decent quality of water for drinking. And that's what these percentages mean. And as for this, in the 1950s, you can get some information from Rodong newspaper in Kimchek City. They completed the construction of the piped water network and 90% access and 50% access. But then moving on to the 1990s, you can get some information from UN reports. Here and there, you can find some evidence. In 1994, it was 86%. In 1996, it was 53%. In 1998, 74%. And in 2008, 87.3%, and in 2017, 58.5%. And there's a huge fluctuation in terms of number, which does not really reflect the reality. So there's this question of whether these data are reliable or not. And also at the same time, you can see that there's a gap between rural and urban areas. And experts would say that there should be a substantial gap between the urban and the rural areas, but these official data don't seem to have much gap. And the most recent data from MICS is maybe the most reliable. There's 70% access in the urban areas and 40% in the rural areas. And this may be the most accurate representation of the water supply situations in North Korea. Now moving on to per person water supply quantity. In the 1950s, in 1950 when the regime was launched, it was 100 liters per person, and this was according to the administrative ordinance of the North Korean regime. So that was 100 liters. And at that time, it was similar in South Korea as well. So in 1950s, 100 liters was maintained. And then there was an initiative in DPRK to increase the water supply to 250 liters per person. And in 1994, it was about 300 liters. And there's water consumption information announced by the Ministry of Unification. In 1995, they took a look at the situations in the cities and counties. And this may be the most recent and the most reliable data. I would say that the numbers before 1995 would be the most accurate. So based on these data, you can come up with the calculations of how much water is needed in different regions. There's 25 million people in North Korea as of 2020. So based on this population of 25 million, we took at this. And in the parentheses, you can see the urbanization rate. As I mentioned earlier, there's got to be a big gap between urban and rural areas in terms of water consumption. And then you can calculate the per currency amount and also the per person water demand. And before 1995, they need about 1.7 billion tons of water. And after 1995, they need about 2.7 billion ton of water. But as I mentioned briefly, I think that 1.7 billion ton would be a most reasonable figure. So that's the demand side. Let's take a look at the supply side. There are some domestic studies and overseas studies, especially in reports announced by the UN. There's some mentioning of water supply in DPRK. So they say that it's about 1 billion ton of water supplied. So there's a gap between 1 billion ton and 1.5 billion ton between the supply and the demand. Here, you can compare between domestic and overseas studies, and there is this breakdown of residential, industrial, and agricultural water supply. In recently for industrial, it will be 4.7 billion ton, and for agriculture, it's about 1 billion, and they have smaller supply for agriculture and larger supply for industrial activities. And for residential water, there is lack of supply, but you can make an assumption that for industrial and agricultural purposes, the supply and the demand are relatively well matched. So if we are to make investments in water works, then we have to focus on providing water supply for residential purposes. The next question is whether there are enough water resources in the DPRK. Here in DPRK, they have similar water resources than South Korea. You can multiply the land size with precipitation. And North Korea is larger in terms of size than South Korea, and they have less precipitation. So overall, the amount of water resources is similar between the two Koreas. But when you take a look at the available water resources, North Korea has more water resources. In DPRK, the average temperature is lower than South Korea, so the evaporation level is much lower. So they have more water resources available for water supply. So it means that they do have sufficient water resources available. But as you may know, when you look at the rivers and streams, there's heavy precipitation during the summer, and in the winter seasons, there's dry seasons. So there's a big gap between the summer seasons and the winter seasons. And to make up for that, in South Korea, we would build dams and we will have reservoirs to store water, and then we will use these water resources when there's a dry season. But in North Korea, they lack such facilities in managing the water resources. As for the DPRK, 60% of the water resources are surface water and 35% are groundwater. In Korea, about 50% of the water resources are related to the dams. That's for the water supply. And then the rest would be streams and surface waters. So if you make this comparison, you can see that in North Korea, they have sufficient water resources, but they do not have sufficient water-related facilities, including dams. So that is why there is a higher reliance on groundwater. Then how about water quality? This is information about water quality from Taedong River. The first column is about organic contamination, and the red means that they exceed the water quality standards. So these are open rivers and streams, And when you look at the contaminants, they have been contaminated due to fertilizers and other organic wastes. So, and then also in some rivers, there is a contamination of inorganic matters because of industrial activities. Then how about the overall waterworks or the quality of the infrastructure? The waterworks began to be constructed during the colonial rule of Japan, and then in the beginning of the North Korean regime, they put investment in the waterworks and the facilities. So up until 1970s, there was priority on water infrastructure improvement. And at that time, Chairman Kim said that it's important to maintain good quality water. But it all ended in 1974. There was the oil shock globally. And since 1974, North Korea has been struggling economically, so they weren't really able to update or maintain the water facilities. So there was massive investment in the 50s and 60s, and all these facilities were powered by electricity, but with lack of electricity, they were not operated properly, and there was some lack of maintenance. And in the DPRK, there is a division in terms of authorities who are supplying water versus who are managing the water and who are making decisions. So because of these discrepancies, they are not really able to maintain the water infrastructure and the facilities. And there are many areas where there's water contamination. And these have been reported to the outside recently. And it means that the existing water facilities in DPRK are in very poor conditions. Now, when you look at this water supply framework in North Korea, they have different organizations in charge of different steps. And in the case of Korea, we have the ministry within the government that will govern the entire water supply, and then there are specific local companies, and then there are these local operators that are governed by the government. But in North Korea, they have different agencies and institutions involved in water supply. It means that they have issues in coordinating all these activities. And this is a comparison between the DPRK and ROK in terms of water supply. And here we have the Ministry of Environment in South Korea who would govern the overall water management. And in North Korea, they have a separate agency. And in South Korea, in North Korea, they have the water supply agency, but they are mainly focused on residential supply. In South Korea, we have K-Water, which is the Water Resources Management Corporation that will govern the entire water supply in the country. But in DPRK, they have local municipalities who would govern their local water supply. In South Korea, we use both the freshwater and the seawater for water supply. But in North Korea, they only use freshwater. And in South Korea, we have the Ministry of Environment that will designate protection areas for water sources. And in DPRK, they have the National Planning Agency. And in South Korea, we have these internal water supply related agencies that will design and construct and manage these facilities. But in North Korea, they have some external agencies. They are not part of the central regime. So there's this lack of coordination. The biggest issue or challenge, as I see it, is that these resources needed for water facility management are provided from the outside. But if these are not provided properly, then these agencies and institutions that are in charge of managing the facilities will face difficulties because they don't have the needed resources. Then what kind of direction do we need to go in supporting North Korea in terms of water supply? In DPRK, there are many economic sanctions, and it is a different country, basically, and there is this issue of inter-Korean relations. So it's not going to be easy for us to do anything about it, but if there are opportunities, then rather than sticking to one route, I think we need to consider various options, and we need to pursue this initiative in parallel with multiple initiatives. For instance, in some marginalized areas, they need smaller facilities. And these can be provided on a humanitarian basis through international organizations. So in some local communities, they may build some small water supply facilities. It could be UN or NGOs. So that is one route. Can you please wrap up? Yes. So in this case, it is not only it's not just about installing these facilities, but also these international organizations can gather some data about the situation down on the ground. And the second route is utilizing economic special zones. And this is where the South Korean authorities can take the initiative. And here in building the waterworks facilities for the entire country, I think we need a separate agency. It could be six-party talks mechanism or some sort of multilateral organization. So this way we can avoid violating UN sanctions while supporting DPRK for water supply improvement. And with that, I'd like to conclude my presentation. Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. As you mentioned in your presentation in the beginning, DPRK has some issues in water supply, and there have not been enough reliable data sources about this. And thank you for putting together various available documents on water supply situations in DPRK.
This is our last presentation for this morning session, be given by Hong Yoon-gun of Hankuk University on North Korea's disaster and the cooperation between North and South Korea. Please keep within 18 minutes. May I have the clicker for the slide? Good morning. My name is Hong Yoon-gun of Hankuk University. I work at the Disaster Management Integration Department. Today I want to talk about North Korea's disaster and cooperation between the two Koreas. I'm going to go in this order. First, talk about the disasters, the natural disasters in DPRK, talk about the characteristics and the cooperation in the disaster area between the two Koreas, and what we have to do in the future. As you all know, disasters can paralyze the state systems and bring about much chaos and conflict. Because they paralyze the state system, they can also lead to a change in the flows of control for a particular country. Recently, the DPRK is going through a triple-layer disaster situation that is almost similar to the arduous march that they had in the mid-90s. This is also something that Kim Jong-un, Chairman Kim Jong-un, mentioned at the October speech that he gave before his party. There's going to be, there are those North Korean sanctions that are placed by the U.S. and UN, and the closing of the borders because of COVID-19 and of all these typhoons and storms. As Chairman Kim Jong-un has said, there are all of these different disaster situations that have aggravated the situation in the DPRK. There have been these border closures between DPRK and China and DPRK and Russia. 2016 Ryan Rock, 2019 Ring Ring, And the storms of this year in August and September, Barbie, Maisak, Haisen, these different heavy rains and storms have brought about a triple-layered disaster situation for the DPRK. That is why this year their economic growth is going to fall to below -5 and -7 territory. This is similar to what they had which during the arduous march of the 1990s, which was about -6.5. Next, I would like to talk about the different current status of the disaster situations in North Korea. So in North Korea, they are one of the countries who are suffering severe natural disasters in the world. I am pulling this data from Belgium's Roubaix University's CRED and from 2007 and 2016. These different mass-scaled natural disasters numbered about 17 for North Korea. There were 10 floods and storms and droughts. What you see here is what happened when the storm Ryan Rock hit DPRK near the Tumen River, together with these heavy rains. And because of this, with the storms, the Tumen River flooded. In Onsang of Hamgyong-bukdo province, the entire area was flooded, leading to displaced peoples, about 140,000 displaced peoples and about 538 fatalities. The central agency, the DPRK state outlet, said that this is the greatest disaster that they had after liberation. Next. Moving on to earthquakes in the DPRK in 2020, according to our meteorological agency's estimates, there are about 21 earthquakes in DPRK over a seismic scale, a Richter scale of 2.0. There are about 25 in 2017 and 13 in 2018. But many of them were smaller scaled, so they did not lead to massive damage. Next, I'd like to move on to social disasters. There are largely explosions, collapses, and infectious disease, and also animal-borne diseases. So from 1950 to 2019, there are about 15 cases of mass-scaled social disasters in the DPRK. In 2004, there was a Yongcheon Station explosion. And this led to about 1,500 casualties, including 154 deaths. And for collapses in 2014, there was a 23-floor Chungbuk apartment building that collapsed, and about 500 people perished as a result. Next, moving on to the infectious diseases. In DPRK, there are many different outbreaks of infectious diseases like TB, malaria, hepatitis B. According to the WHO's 2016 World Tuberculosis Report in 2015, there are about 15,000 people who died of tuberculosis, and there are currently about 140,000 TB patients with malaria as well. In some areas like Hwanghae-do or Gangwon-do province, many of these residents are exposed to infection risk, and there are about 10,000 malaria patients annually. For animal infectious diseases as well, in 2019 May, in the Chagangdo Ushi County Buksan Cooperative Farm, the African swine flu outbreak started there, so about 77 pigs died and 22 were killed, according to OIE. Korea's information agency, Central Information Agency, said that in Pugan and Hamgyong-bukdo, many of the pigs in the pig farms have been killed as a result of this. with the novel coronavirus as well. At the Supreme People's Assembly Permanent Standing Committee meeting that was held in February, they said that there were no COVID-19 patients in DPRK. And also in October, Kim Jong-un Chairman Kim Jong-un said to his people that there are no patients of COVID-19 in DPRK, and he was thankful that there were no sick patients in this country. However, if we look at some international organization studies, we've seen how China has shut down some of the borders near North Korea. This appears to show that there are at least some infected persons, confirmed patients in DPRK as well. This image is where a party leading official is seen apologizing to the residents of the apartment building that collapsed in DPRK. So I don't have much time, so I'm going to skip over these slides. Moving on to the different characteristics of the DPRK disasters, there are three things that I want to talk about. There are more natural disasters than man-made disasters. In 1995, there was a massive flood, and this led to about $15 billion worth of damages. It was recorded as one of the 50 worst natural disasters that year. These natural disasters typically occur as storms or heavy rain in the summer season. Secondly, because of much land development and environmental degradation, there are all of these different complex disasters that occur through secondary disasters such as landslides, soil erosion, and collapses. Thirdly, North Korea has said that there are no COVID-19 patients at all, and they are refusing disease control goods. And this is a sort of erratic, abnormal behavior, which is a particular characteristic of a DPRK's response. Next are some of the cooperative cases in the disaster domain of the two Koreas. These are some of the areas where the two Koreas discussed disaster cooperation. So in 1991, there was a high-level summit, and the Annex Agreement mentioned that if there's a disaster in either of the two countries, then they are going to provide support on a humanitarian basis. And then the 2000 June 15 Joint Declaration, 2007 October 4th Joint Statement, and 2018 September Pyongyang Joint Statements. They also had these discussions about disaster domain cooperation. I'm going to skip over these slides as well in the interest of time. And then talking about flood damages, some of the interesting things to note here is that after liberation, when South Korea had massive flooding, North Korea was the first to offer support there. In 1995, in June, North Korea offered some relief to South Korea through the South Korean Red Cross. North Korea reached out to South Korea first, and the two regimes agreed to that. They sent about 10,000 tons of cement and different medical goods, rice as well, to the South Korean side. This was done in 1984. However, in 1995, later on, South Korea provided a rice worth of 150,000 tons to North Korea. And for the restoration of the meteorological equipment at DPRK, South Korea offered assistance worth about $50,000 through the WMO. Since 2000, after the joint declaration was signed, there were many of these other cooperative relief that was offered. This slide I have been able to take that from Kim Il-sung's book, and it says here that he mentions here his decision to offer some relief to Namjoseon, or South Korea. These are some of the photographs that were taken at the time from Bukpyeong port, and these relief materials were sent through Panmunjom. I don't have much time, but there are this information on the slide that you see here on forestry insects and pest control and infectious diseases, and the Baekdusan volcano wildfires. You can refer to that on my presentation. But I'd like to move on to our future direction for inter-Korean disaster cooperation. The two Koreas have to sign a binding and irreversible joint response agreement. In 1972, Kim Il-sung and the South Korean high-level general met together, and after that, there were some working level discussions, dozens of working level discussions that did not lead to fruition. This is to blame for both sides because the summits were largely for show. However, in the case of Germany, they signed a disaster joint response agreement in 1973 based on mutual trust, and this was an agreement, not necessarily just a statement, and this led to more disaster control efforts, especially in the border regions. This was a binding agreement on disaster cooperation. Just as what the two Germanys did before unification, Korea should also think about doing the same with the DPRK and prioritize disaster area cooperation because this area does not have many political interests. And there needs to be consensus based on this area first so that we can lead up to a binding and irreversible agreement and not just a statement. For an agreement, this would have to be signed off by the National Assembly and the Supreme People's Assembly of the DPRK. The agreement would have to list the mandate, the enforcement agency, the mission, and other specific details. Secondly, there needs to be a permanent delegation on disaster cooperation installed in both Pyongyang and Seoul so that they can work primarily on disaster cooperation. This will be the only mandate that's given to them. They should not close or shut down their operations because of different political agendas. They have to have a consistent disaster cooperation and exchange of information to have a very concrete and practical mandate. The border regions such as Gangwon-do, Gyeonggi-do, and UN, different domestic local NGOs, and even the private sector should be able to play a part in this effort. Thirdly, the different areas of disaster cooperation that we've seen thus far should be included in this going forward. And some of the new areas that we have to look at are examples such as microfine dust, yellow dust, so these air pollution areas, and to try to come up with a legal database for the two Koreas. Emergency relief channel needs to be established, and a disaster insurance. This insurance scheme and a database and also a risk map, this is something that is very important. When I issued a survey on North Korean defectors in July of 2019, this was the first and second respective areas that were that the respondents said would be most urgent to do, especially in areas of disaster cooperation. Next is areas of the priorities of the respondents. Lastly, moving on to the conclusion, Kim Jong-un is a young leader, and in responding to disasters, he has shown an attitude that is different from his father and his grandfather. After he came to power in 2014, he legislated the Act on Disaster Prevention and Recovery. And in 2019, September, when the storm Ling came to the DPRK, he held an emergency expanded meeting and stressed the importance of storm response. In 2020, with COVID-19, he also held an expanded meeting with this party and said that this would be very serious if they had repercussions in the DPRK. He also did the same thing in response to the storms of August and September in 2020. He was very encouraging of his party elite. He's really trying to show off his image as a leader who cares for his people. This is a picture taken of the Central Military Committee meeting that was held for the Workers' Party one day before the typhoon Ling Ling came to the DPRK on September 6, 2019. So Kim Jong-un is very aggressive in pursuing disaster relief and disaster response. And so this is where joint cooperation would be very important. This is also an area that is not included as part of UN sanctions. So as the two Germanys did in the past, these are humanitarian assistance. South Korean government should also have to engage in aggressive response to try to have a disaster cooperation also for microfine dust and all of these new urgent issues, the different IFRC, WHO, disaster response organizations in the border regions, the different NGOs in the DMZ. If these different local offices can be hosted in the border region or DMZ, that could support permanent peace in the Korean Peninsula. Disaster cooperation between the two Koreas could ease military tension between the two Koreas and also contribute to economic growth and also be conducive to political reform and openness of DPRK. A stable disaster management of the DPRK would also have direct and indirect effects for South Korea as well, so it has very important political implications. Lastly, disaster can impact people's lives and property. So we have to work to protect people's lives and property from disasters. This is not something that is done on a part of goodwill by the state, but it's a primary responsibility of the state. Yes, thank you very much. For the purposes of our discussion, I'd like to ask our discussants to please come forward and take their seats on the podium. I think if we take a look at the internal data in the DPRK, Kim Jong-un has often mentioned a disaster response. So I think that the leadership, the party leadership also thinks that this is a very important issue. And as we prepare for unification, we have to better understand the disaster response situation in the DPRK. Dr. Hong told us about this in his presentation. So thank you very much.
Now we're going to have a discussion session. According to the program, we're going to proceed. So first of all, I am going to invite Mr. Jong Joon-hee from the Ministry of Unification for his panel discussion comments for about 8 minutes.
Yes, I've just been introduced. My name is Jong Joon-hee of the Ministry of Unification. I was asked to talk about the different issues in inter-Korean exchange and cooperation, so I'm going to talk about that before I move on to my discussion. So as you know, today we're here to discuss the sustainable development of the DPRK. So I think we have to discuss the importance of exchange and cooperation between the two Koreas. And for sustainable development, we have to have unification first of all. But the efforts for unification have to take place in 3 different directions. First, we have to have the right environment. And we have to have good environments both here locally and internationally for ties, exchange, cooperation that can have a good environment between the two Koreas. This could take the form of summit-level talks, more dialogue. The starting point for this is, as you well know, in the 77 Declaration in 1988, where all of the government ministries really worked towards inter-Korean cooperation and exchange. There are two areas that we can think about. Well, first is economic and socio-cultural. We began with economic cooperation. After Kim Dae-jung came to power, we started with the Mount Kumgangsan tours, which led to the launch of economic exchange between the two Koreas. This also led to rail, road, and the Kaesong complex cooperations, Kumgangsan, rail, and the Kaesong complex. So these were the three major economic exchanges. And then with socio-cultural, I think there are sports, for example, and religious affairs. And also some academic exchanges were also had in Kaesong's Manwoldae project, for example. In environment, I think if I were to mention a few things, we did hear the presentation on disaster response earlier, but Baekdusan, a volcano study, joint study between the two Koreas. There were about a dozen meetings between the two Koreas. And as I mentioned before, there was also disaster cooperation, even in forestry resource management. Because 28% of North Korea's forest cover has been degraded. Forestry resource cooperation is also directly related to their food scarcity issue. So this is a humanitarian issue. And in 2008, since then on, there are about 2 of these trips made to the DPRK to try to have a study on the ground. And with the private sector cooperation, we've had continuous forestry resource cooperation, planting new trees, and etc. And also, there's been joint management measures that have been done between the two parties beginning in 2001 to discuss ahead of time, before we discharge rainwater from the dams, for example. And some of these have actually come to fruition. And in 2009, 2019, up until then, we've worked to try to create the DMZ area into a peace zone, although there have been some stalemates in that. After the Hanoi summit, we've seen some changes between the inter-Korean exchange, so I'd like to mention that first of all. After the Hanoi US-DPRK summit, in October 2019, the two Koreas announced a new way forward. And at the end of that year, so last year, COVID-19 erupted and the borders were closed down. The socio-cultural exchange that took place around that time was that inter-Korean soccer match was held in Pyongyang for the Qatar World Cup, which was held without an audience. And they also blew up the liaison office and shut down the rail cooperation between the two Koreas. So this led to some extreme case. When we look at the cooperation, we never could go beyond political affairs. The Tamiflu support, the Kaesong industrial complex, and the 50,000 tons of rice that we were trying to give them through the WHO. North Korea did not respond to any of these efforts, and North Korea just continued to talk about some fundamental issues that have to be resolved with the Qatar World Cup and individual tours to the DPRK. When South Korea issued these announcements, there was no mention of this in particular from the DPRK side. So when we take a look at the attitude of the DPRK after February of 2019, North Korea has tried to shut South Korea out of exchange and cooperation. And they don't want to release any information. If any of the projects have been released and made open to the public, then they do not go forth with the project and they don't want to sign any agreements. This year, with the EC cooperation and DPRK said that the May agreement is dead. We said that we should do a status survey on the DMZ. We also try to have the local governments also participate in the exchange and cooperation. But despite all that, DPRK has not responded to any of that. Instead, they took a very drastic route by exploding the liaison office, and this accelerated tensions between the two Koreas. The WFP $10 million worth of aid to DPRK that we suggested, the DPRK is refusing that aid as well. It feels that our cooperation is still mired in the traps of politics. And even if there is an agreement, we have to have a separate agreement for the implementation and then a third agreement for the implementation of that agreement. And so there's this lack of trust between the two Koreas because we keep going around in circles just signing papers. This status review that we've consistently been asked for, DPRK has refused that because of the so-called military tension that they've said that they've found it uncomfortable, and they just are asking for goods and equipment. They want us to show trust up front by providing them with goods and equipment. So for rail and road network cooperation, we say that we have to do an in-depth study first and then come up with a comprehensive plan and then bring in the goods and equipment to go forth with the project. But the DPRK doesn't try to understand that process. This has led to some difficulties in engaging with joint collaboration. And sometimes they just ask for money instead of in-kind goods. They said that they will purchase themselves through China, which means that they want to engage in exchange and cooperation, but they want to downscale the participation of South Korea. So what should we do in this regard going forward? I think that we have to move forward as humanitarian, civilian help, and infrastructure. So it's a 3-deal package. We would have to work together with the international community to try to induce North Korea to come forward and come up with a cooperative environment to facilitate this. And has been mentioned by our presenters, I want to first of all discuss Oh Kyung-seop's presentation. I really listened well to the governing discourse and economic policy in Kim Jong-un regime. I really agree with what you said, that this is a tool that Kim Jong-un is using to have that one-person rule regime in place. But do they even have an economic policy the way that we think about? And we also thought that there was the market economy in place, but I want to know what kind of impact this market economy is having right now. And you said that their foreign reserves are depleted, but I don't agree because I feel that they have continuously built up the foreign reserves because they still have that internal absorbing mechanism of foreign reserves, and they have been able to have these unofficial illicit sales of weapons to third parties. So I don't think that their foreign reserves have been able to be depleted in such a short period of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So Mr. Jong from the Ministry of Unification gave a summary of the inter-Korean exchanges, and I think there is some questions to Mr. Oh. So we will later cover the questions at the end of the discussions. Moving on to Mr. Jong Don-jun from Korea Environment Institute. So Dr. Jun, would you limit your comments to 8 minutes, please? Hello, I'm Jong Dong-jun from Korea Environment Institute. I'd like to thank the presenters for their presentations. I was able to learn a lot from their presentations. In a larger framework, I'd like to focus on promoting sustainable development of the Korean Peninsula and promoting communication and cooperation. So with that in mind, I'd like to comment on all these 4 presentations and share my views as well. As for the first presentation by Dr. Oh, you can see that the governing discourse of Chairman Kim Jong-un's regime is promoting nuclear capabilities and developing its economy at the same time. But from the sustainable development perspective, nuclear capabilities, these programs are military and political issues, so it is something that other experts can discuss. But as for the economic development, in order to maintain the regime, they are obsessed about economic development. But if nuclear issues are not resolved because of these UN sanctions and all the other sanctions on North Korea, it will be very difficult for North Korea to develop its economy. As many people have already mentioned, it is not easy to find a breakthrough in promoting inter-Korean relations. Having said that, at this time, it may not be right or too early to discuss sustainable development in North Korea because we don't have a lot of feasible options to pursue at this moment. Because we still have military and security issues that have not been resolved. And if they are resolved in any time soon, then as Dr. Oh mentioned in his presentation, DPRK's number one priority is to revitalize its economy. So rather than promoting a step-by-step development for sustainability, we may need to take some dramatic action to push for the economic development for the benefit of the people. And in doing so, there may be additional concerns. But South Korea has the experience of rapid economic development. And in this process, South Korea also made a lot of mistakes and there were some problems or side effects. In order to prevent these problems from occurring in North Korea, we can work closely with DPRK so that we can share our lessons learned and all the trials and errors that we've had in the past with North Korea so that they can avoid making similar mistakes. And moving on to the second presentation by Dr. Han on future integration of environmental legislation, I would say that it was just very encouraging for me to imagine having a single legal framework between the two Koreas regarding environment. But if we are to get there, as was already mentioned in the presentation, I think we need to go through many different steps. And for all these steps, we need to find ways to address many challenges that we may expect. So we need to prepare for different scenarios. From the perspective of sustainable development, if the DPRK economy begins to grow again, then there can be many different ways of providing assistance and aid. We may utilize international ODA, or we may provide assistance unilaterally from South Korea, and we may pursue inter-Korean investment, joint investment, or we may pursue indirect and direct investment from South Korea. So there are different investment options that we can utilize. And depending on what option we choose, there may be different considerations about environment that we need to make. And the World Bank or international organizations, when they provide assistance to developing countries, they also demand environmental aspects. So there are some guidelines regarding that, but whether it is assistance or DA or investment, the bottom line is we need to be able to do some environment assessment. So when we provide direct assistance or direct investment, we may need to apply international guidelines on environment impact assessment. So if we prepare for these guidelines in advance, when the DPRK economy begins to develop and when there are opportunities arise, then we will be able to address some of the environmental concerns by utilizing these guidelines. Sustainability is a very big topic, but if we narrow it down to environmental issues, these are quite sensitive issues from the perspective of international relations, and some environmental issues can be used as a tool to attack or criticize North Korea. So we need to be careful in approaching environmental issues involving North Korea. Moving on to the third presentation about disaster response and international cooperation. it was about water supply situations in North Korea, what we can do. The presentation was really informative because I was able to learn about the water situations in North Korea. And we can approach this topic from the economic perspective and the humanitarian aid perspective. When it comes to investing in the water infrastructure, as I mentioned earlier, depending on the investment or assistance types, there are various guidelines on environment, and we need to apply these guidelines for the environment so that these infrastructure can be developed in an environment-friendly way. And finally, about disaster response and what we can do between the two Koreas. We need to approach disasters from a humanitarian perspective. Currently, inter-Korean relations are quite sour. And given this situation, disaster-related cooperation can provide a very good breakthrough and momentum in facilitating inter-Korean exchanges. And this is something that we need to provide assistance on the humanitarian basis. So even before any political or other issues are resolved, we can approach North Korea in providing help for disaster response. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've heard from Jong Dong-jun talking about the sustainable development of a Korean peninsula, and he gave a discussion, some opinions on all of the presenters. So after we've heard from all of the discussants, we would like to give some time to the presenters to respond to that. Next, we'd like to hear from Park Hong-seo of HUBS. I'd like to give you 8 minutes. Hello. I am from CIAS of Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. I'm a research professor. Today I want to talk about Oh Kyung-seok's presentation and Han Sang-hoon's presentation. So in this sphere, I have to say that the two professors' presentations really enlightened me because there are some areas that I had not known about at all. So I'd like to thank you for giving me that information, and I'd like to briefly offer up my opinions. So first of all, on Dr. or Professor Oh Kyung-seok's presentation, I think that to try to come up with a good North Korea policy, we have to really understand what exactly Kim Jong-un is thinking, what Kim Jong-un regime's preferences are. So we need to have a very good understanding of that. And seen from that context, I think the presentation is really comprehensive and it includes a lot of information. When I read this presentation, you talked about governing discourse. I thought that perhaps we need more of a theoretical framework for this. If we talk about Machiavelli or Michel Foucault, they all talk about power and the objective of power. They have all of these different theories that they've already announced. So maybe if you can include some of their thoughts, maybe you can have a well-rounded theoretical context. Machiavelli said that for a ruler, there are these internal and external enemies, these threats from these different enemies, and the Machiavelli ruler, the prince, can respond to this. And in fact, the threat that comes from the internal enemies is even more severe than external enemies. Foucault gave about 3 different dimensions of power: violence, rule, and economy. That the right ruler has to use a hybrid version of all of these 3. Which means, if we take this into consideration, the Kim Jong-un regime is also making use of violence and rule. So rule here is basically ruling by force with a sword and using socialism to try to have carve this socialist tendencies on its people. The economic affairs is where they turn to these economic affairs of the people. And Kim Jong-un regime is drawing upon these three different axes for its rule. However, the problem here is that for the strategy of violence and the strategy of economy, I think, as you pointed out in the economy, can they really stand together? Because they are in direct contradiction to each other. So how can this contradiction be eased? I think that's a very fundamental dilemma. And we cannot really solve this dilemma on our own. We can just manage it, which is for the DPRK, if they cannot solve this contradiction, if they cannot solve this dilemma, then they will never be able to find a solution. Oh, they might be able to have the nuclear weapons, but because of that, the nuclear weapons, they have to give up economic development. Can they find a breakthrough out of this very difficult situation? I wonder what you think about that. That's my first question to you. Many presenters also gave their opinions about this, but I wanted to ask you what your thoughts are. And moving on to my second presenter, Dr. Han Sang-un. I think that this is a very important and meaningful discussion. I think that DPRK, within a capitalist international order, it is the only ghetto that is left remaining in the world. So in the future, if North Korea wants to open itself up to the world economy, there could be one of two scenarios that plays out. There's the bad scenario and the good scenario. The bad scenario, it will be like imperialism in the 19th century, where they lead to massive violence down the road. I don't think that this is very feasible right now, but in any case, this is where energy consumption, environmental capitalism, environmental polluting capitalism will be forcefully applied to the DPRK. So this is not a very good scenario. And if that were to happen, this would mean that the environmental problems in the DPRK right now would be aggravated. The second scenario is similar to what you've mentioned, which is where DPRK can be a role model through this, what you say is ecological restructuring. This means that this could be an alternative to an energy consumption, power generating scenario. So with these two scenarios, obviously, I think that the latter is personally more right, and also it is more legitimate. However, for us to go down that route, Dr. Han mentioned the legal basis that we need to establish, and obviously we need to think about the legal issues of this matter, but this is also a political and a capital issue as well. The state and capital. How are we going to manage these two crux of the problem? So trying to institutionalize the legal framework, even that is something that DPRK has to voluntarily accept. And as I mentioned before, this logic of capital, this supranational, transnational capital logic the capital that will fly into DPRK and try to turn that into a revenue generating country. How are we going to defend against that? What is the grid strategy that you have in mind?
Thank you very much, Professor Park. You commented on Professor Oh and Professor Han's presentations, and there were some questions raised by him, so we will address them at the end. Finally, I'd like to invite Dr. Ki-young Lee from Gyeonggi Research Institute for his comments. Hello, I am Lee Ki-young from Gyeonggi Research Institute. Can you hear me well? Yes. Yes, we can hear you. Today, I'm going to make my discussions on inter-Korean cooperation in terms of water supply and disaster response. As was mentioned by other panel members, when the inter-Korean relations improve, our discussions would be very meaningful, but unfortunately, the inter-Korean relations are still in a deadlock, so it is quite unfortunate. I hope that the inter-Korean relations will improve soon. First of all, about water supply situations in the presentation, he said that the access to managed water is 50 to 80%. There's a wide range, but these data are not really reliable, in my opinion. And I had other opportunities to talk to people from North Korea. And they said that in reality, when it comes to access to clean water, the situation is much worse than we imagine. And during the presentation, I was also able to get a lot of useful information. In Korea, we utilize surface water, including rivers and streams and dams. But as for North Korea, they rely more on groundwater. So the reliance is 35%. And they do not have the nationwide water supply infrastructure, but they are fragmented and managed by local governments. When it comes to developing water resources, in Korea, we have the nationwide approach, so we don't have much problem. But we have the risk, concentration risk, because if there is a problem with the central infrastructure, it may impact the entire water system in Korea. So when you look at the details, the water supply system in North Korea is not perfect, but overall, I think it has its own benefits because it's managed by the local authorities. And as was mentioned in the presentation, international organizations can take the initiative in improving water facilities in North Korea, and I agree to that proposal. But later, when the inter-Korean relations improve, then we may want to be involved once again, because in the past we discussed economic special zones and how to improve infrastructure. And there was a lot of interest in developing systems in North Korea, especially in the special economic zones. I think we have to be careful about designating special economic zones. If we are to pursue a large-scale project, especially in developing special economic zones, these will include water supply infrastructure as well. In the past, we would designate a special economic zone and then consider water side later on. But what I want to propose is that in the DMZ and the surrounding areas, the nature is well protected. So even when we pursue a special economic zone, we will have to avoid these areas and designate an area far away from the DMZ for special economic zones for the purpose of protecting water sources. And for these DMZ and environment areas, we need to, even if we want to designate them as special economic zones, we will have to make sure that water will not be wasted. And moving on to the second topic, I think that there are two ways for cooperation. First of all, we can jointly manage shared rivers, including Rimjin River. And the second way of cooperation is when the inter-Korean relations improve, we can help DPRK in strengthening the flood response systems. In 2000, there was some efforts to prevent floods in Rimjin River, and there was an agreement or memorandum of understanding between the two Koreas, but it did not go well because of the political issues. But in the future, when the inter-Korean relations improve, I think we can revitalize this project. And as for the shared rivers and estuaries, first of all, we can build a dam on the Han River, and the water would be flown to the West Sea, and this led to the decline in the water resources in Rimjin River, and there was some issues in the Paju area. And in the northern side, they discharged water from a dam all of a sudden, and the bottom of the Imjin River, there was a sudden increase of water level in Imjin River, causing some casualties. And these were two major incidents. In the past, when we had some water shortage, the Agriculture Corporation came up with policies to increase water supply for agriculture and industries, and they were able to manage the water supply in a more flexible manner. And also there was this Gunnam Dam built, and when there is a sudden release of water from the northern side, then we are now able to control the water flow. Now, this year in 2020, we had the longest rainy season, and I remember it was early August that in Imjin River, the water damage was serious and the floods were very bad. So the Gunnam Dam almost reached the flood level. And then the Pilsung Bridge, the water level was record high. And these were very emergency situations, but on the southern side, we were not able to get access to any real-time information. We didn't really know how much rain has fallen and how much water or flood situation. So this year, we realized that there should be more cooperation and data sharing between the two Koreas. I understand that the inter-Korean relations not very good right now, but as for the flood-related issues and water management issues, I think we need to resume dialogue on this with North Korea. Thank you.
Professor Lee Ki-young talked about Kim Seung-hyun and Hong Yoon-gun's presentations. We are supposed to conclude the session at 12, but we don't have much time, so I'd like to give about 1 minute 30 seconds to each speaker. So maybe you can respond very briefly to the comments that were raised. So we'll go in order of the presentation. We'll ask Dr. Oh.
I will be brief. I would first like to thank the discussants for their comments. As Mr. Jong mentioned, economic policies. Are there any economic policies in DPRK? He was quite doubtful about it. And I understand why he was saying that, because when you think about DPRK economic policies, there are documents, but these are quite different from the reality. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there were many issues on statistics, and all these statistics were not accurate. So I think that the situation in DPRK is quite similar. As for foreign reserves issues, the estimated figure for foreign reserves in DPRK includes foreign reserves in the private sector as well. And for those researchers who are studying the DPRK economy, produce these, so I want to believe that. But of course, when it comes to the outlook on foreign reserves of DPRK, well, DPRK has to earn foreign currency through exports, and currently illicit export of weapons is not possible due to sanctions, and also forestry and agricultural products and other natural resources cannot be exported to the overseas markets. So gradually they will have even more problem in maintaining foreign reserves. And currently the two Koreas are not getting along well, and about these economic situations, I think we still need to discuss this. And I was able to learn a lot about water situations and environment situations and disaster response. And all these areas are what we need to focus on in when our relations improve. But anyhow, one of the questions was, when there's rapid development in North Korea, they may go through or experience similar side effects that South Korea has had. And I believe that this is a reasonable concern, but in reality, it may not be the case, because in the ideal situation, we'll have to make sure to reduce any side effects. But in almost all countries in the world, they experience some side effects and problems in the rapid economic development, so DPRK will not be an exception. And so DPRK is very likely to go through all these challenges even though they know that these are possible challenges, just like the cases of the two Germanys. And regarding another comment from Mr. Park, yes, DPRK has to give up its nuclear programs if they want to improve their economy. If they do not open up, even to a certain degree, to the outside world, they are not really able to grow their economy. But still, DPRK has this Pyeongjin policy focusing on military and economy at the same time. And this began with Kim Il-sung and then moving on to Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un. But the essence is the same. They want to maintain military forces. So that's their number one priority. And at the same time, they want to develop the economy as well. If they are to redesign this philosophy or this overall approach, it means that they will have to redefine their philosophy. And this requires a big breakthrough or a turning point. And the only possible way is for the North Korean leadership to realize that they can maintain their regime even if they give up on the nuclear programs. And then they may pivot slowly or quickly after such realization. But now, it's not very likely for DPRK to have this kind of breakthrough or momentum. Now we have to see what the U.S. President, Mr. Biden, will do going forward, and we'll have to kind of wait and see how things will go.
I'm sorry I couldn't give you more time. Next, we'd like to hear from Dr. Han Sang-un. Yes, I'd like to keep my remarks brief. So, for DPRK investment, maybe having an environmental impact assessment report to assess the feasibility of investment in DPRK. I think that when we provide aid to the DPRK, this is something that we have to consider. Dr. Jong said this as much in his discussion together with his comments on Park's presentation. The German unification case and the Korean unification case, if we compare the two, if we feel that similarly with East Germans, that the DPRK residents also want that development, do they want this to go that same route? And is this something that we still want 30, 40 years later? I think that the situation with the Republic of Korea, this net zero, and it's not something that just Korea want to do on its own. Many countries around the world want to go through carbon neutrality by 2050, and if the DPRK wants that, they can be a part of that. And in that case, this ecological restructuring that I talked about in my presentation for Baekdusan, Kumgangsan, DMZ, and Kenmak Park, and all of these different areas can be a biosphere zone or protection zones, and they need to go through a very strict management. But we also have to do with different tech giants, like different giant companies like Facebook, Google, LG, Samsung, that these different companies that use fossil fuels, that these big companies that use these fossil fuels should not be granted any more subsidies from the government. Then that's what the government has to persuade so that DPRK can be declared a carbon neutral zone. And if we can do that, then the funding that we can give to a DPRK would be given in as a form of investment. So no one would say that this is just DPRK is just giving money to the DPRK. And this could be something that big companies could come around with, because this is in alignment with what international organizations want, with the international regulations. And the ROK government is also going to establish a committee on carbon neutrality soon. All of this would be in alignment so that the DPRK residents can come around to receive the funding and the projects. So this is going to be very different from what we saw in the 1990s with the two Germanys, where East Germany said that they just want to be as West Germany does. And if we show the DPRK residents what happened to Germany 30, 40 years later, then we can get an encouraging sign from them.
Thank you. Next, Professor Kim. I conducted this research because when North Korea opens its doors or is united with South Korea, then there's this issue of infrastructure. Some people would think that South Korean parties will go there and develop infrastructure, but I don't really think so. Then if we do have some share and participate in the infrastructure development, what can we do? And that led to this particular study. Because I believe that our number one job is to understand the current situation of North Korea. And secondly, Dr. Lee talked about comprehensive nationwide water supply versus domestic or local. As nationwide water supply can be understood as a wholesaler, and the local authorities' water supply would be a retail. And that is why we have a high reliance on the dam in South Korea, but they don't have that in North Korea. So local communities were not really able to develop dams or other massive infrastructure. And that is why they have a high dependence on the groundwater resources. And as you mentioned, I think that there are pros and cons of different approaches. But if we are to go to North Korea now, then we may go for the nationwide infrastructure, but we have to consider that the current situation cannot be overhauled overnight, and we have to understand the situation and choose the appropriate option. Thank you. And finally, Professor Hong.
Yes, because we don't have much time, I'll keep it short. I think that going forward, inter-Korean cooperation, and when we approach DPRK, some of the things that we have to consider is that when we deal with a DPRK, we talk about humanitarian, mutual reciprocity, one nation, one people. There are many of these elements that the DPRK would refuse, because in the past when West Germany approached East Germany, they tried to see that from the point of view of supply and demand. They looked at economic profit and regime stability. The DPRK is that in East Germany, they wanted to ask for regime stability first and then economic stability. And West Germany responded in kind. They didn't just use the carrots and the whip. They used both. And so they didn't think about mutual reciprocity. This lead to this joint disaster management agreement was signed on by these two Germanys. They didn't really agree on other areas such as the economic front, but after 1980s, later on, West Germany continued to expand their cultural influences as well. So going forward with the ROK government as well, when they deal with the DPRK, they have to not just try to make the argument from the point of view of the supplier, from the giver. There's these joint inter-Korean rail projects and etc. South Korea should try to see North Korea and their demands coming from the side of the consumer. One of the important things is to try to guarantee a regime stability. What are the things that we can do to guarantee that? And even if that is not something that we can do, persuade North Korea that this is not going to hurt their regime stability. I think that with this disaster management, with the streams and infectious disease management, these are some of the things that are not necessarily going to hurt the regime stability or hurt Kim Jong-un's image. There might be some aspects that could do so. So for those areas that could threaten Kim Jong-un, and he might feel threatened, then we have to be very careful about that and have persuade DPRK that this is in alignment with their economic benefits.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry that I was not able to give you sufficient time for your discussion. I would like to say thank you to all of you for being here with us for the morning session. With this, let us conclude the first session. Thank you very much.